Unfortunately, the manga and anime don't do a great job of elaborating why goblins are such a problem and why they are constantly underestimated. In essence, the issue with goblin hunting being dangerous revolves around the inadequate rewards. Goblins are relatively weak, and the villages they are targeting are usually impoverished and therefore unable to offer a substantial bounty. This low payment then discourages high-level adventurers from taking on goblin-related quests. Instead, these missions tend to attract inexperienced adventurers who are then tasked with dealing with what the guild deems to be a minor threat. They are eager to advance in their ranks and help those in need, but this eagerness, this combination of bad pay, being naive, or being overconfident in their own abilities and having a low level of experience, perhaps even starting on their very first adventure, often leads to tragic outcomes, especially for younger adventurers. Additionally, the guilds are very well aware that if they continue sending parties to deal with goblins, eventually the goblin threat will be eliminated. And I personally really like this grim, dark, gritty reality of finance, of spare man capacity, as the ultimate reason why goblins are oftentimes underestimated and able to defeat a human party. Okay. Let's first talk about why there would be people who specialize in goblin hunting. And by that, I don't mean that there would be a specific singular Goblin Slayer guy, but that in a realistic fantasy world with dangerous monsters, Goblin Slayer would actually be a normal and one of the most common adventurer professions or subcategories. In my personal opinion, adventurers would specialize much more than depicted in fantasy novels and anime, because it is that much more efficient. For example, having 10 teams of Goblin Slayers, 10 teams of Orc Slayers, 10 teams of specializing in wolf combat, 20 experts in alligator hunting, 15 specialized in griffin hunting, and the rest is then attempting to bring down a wyvern or an entire dragon, is just so much more effective than having each of the 104-member parties do a bit of everything. I mean, having a blacksmith who's also a steelworker, a painter and an office clerk, and who would be switching between all of the 4 professions every 3 days or so, wouldn't make much sense in our world either. So adventurers would similarly specialize with categories like explorers and cartographers, dragon hunters, orc hunters, troll hunters, giant bat hunters, and of course, goblin slayers. Also, adventurers would cooperate and adapt their teams based on what they need for their current monster hunt. And with that said, let's finally move on to their equipment. First, slayers would carry bags, backpacks and pouches containing supplies such as healing potions, food, water, antidotes, tools and extra ammunition. These supplies would be especially important during extended hunts, and resupply points like villages are not readily available. Of course, slayers would also forage for what they would need, and could also gather water from plants, collect berries, roots and fruits, and even catch rabbits and other game if necessary. And next we have the support gear. Goblin slayers would also carry various tools to aid them on their various missions. For example, they would have a lockpick for dealing with locks that some goblins have salvaged from villages they raided. And they would also have something to break through barriers. Whether it be the dull end of their sword, just some axe or some hammer, or anything else, they don't want to be trapped with no way out. So a shovel might also be part of their equipment. And of course, a knife for basic cutting duties is still the standard for most members of any armed organization. Not even the army, just armed organization, like, for example, mercenaries. And of course, Goblin Slayers would also have the means to start a fire, and it doesn't matter if they have some matches, a lance, 2 sticks and some dry leaves, or a fire-based spell for this. Apart from this, good footwear would be extremely important, and it would likely enabling them to deal with most of the goblins' more simple traps on its very own. I mean, if a poisoned thorn can't penetrate your metal reinforced boots, then you're safe. If not, you're sorry. Additionally, the Goblin Slayers themselves would also use traps as an integral part of their strategy. No, not Astolfo. These Slayers would use snares, tripwires, bear traps, and caltropes, among other things, to immobilize or injure, or ideally eliminate goblins altogether, either before a direct confrontation with them, or as a deadly surprise, all on their own, for their patrols, or other troops of goblins venturing outside of their safe nest. And of course, poisoned arrows, swords or spears would also be employed, just to ensure that any goblin that escaped would still meet not a quick, but still a deadly end. Once again, the goal of these slayers is not to fight fair and honorable, but to efficiently eliminate goblins. So even if a wounded goblin would manage to escape into the dense underbush of a forest or a similar terrain, it would eventually succumb to the poison. Especially because they have a fairly small body compared to humans. And now let's talk about the type of armor a slayer would wear. Just like in the show, Goblin Slayers would prefer light-weighted armor, made from materials like metal or perhaps gambeson. This armor would provide essential protection against physical attacks, while also allowing agility during combat and not impede movement too much. And I'm not only talking about the movement of joints or something like this, no, I am talking about running for extended periods of time. So the total weight of the armor would likely be around 10-20 kilograms at most, and the minimum equipment in terms of body armor would probably include a helmet and good footwear. Again, helmets would be indispensable, because they would be protecting the head, which again is one of the few highly vulnerable areas for a human facing a goblin attack. I mean, think of the helmet as the standard armor part that is still used in modern military units today. And the optimal combination for battling goblins might also involve a shield in the offhand and a spear or a sword as the primary weapon in the strong hand. As for weapons, again, the spear would probably be the most common choice for Goblin Slayers, due to its extended reach. The best way not to get hit in combat is just to stay outside of the goblin's effective range. Instead of relying on your fancy battle skills to evade or block every single attack, especially because where there is one goblin, a second or a third is not that far off. However, slayers would also likely employ swords, axes, maces, bows or clubs, and swords offer the advantage of quick readiness for follow-up attacks, while weapons with long reach provide a significant advantage against goblins whose weapons are typically too short since they are weaker. So if the slayer group is united, then they would use spears and longer ranged weapons. But if they find themselves in a pitched melee battle, then they would draw their swords. However, any weapon capable of causing harm to a human would also be effective against goblins. In some cases, even a simple stone, whether wielded in the fist or thrown, would prove sufficient to dispatch a lone goblin, all on its own. And finally, building upon this, a slingshot would be easy to transport and highly effective, since ammunition would be readily available almost anywhere, and since it would still pack enough of a punch to finish off a goblin. So slayers would probably carry slingshots with them, and new ones could also quickly learn how to use them between missions. And they would also have plenty of opportunity to perfect their aim. And this might indeed apply for all monster hunters, since being able to do basic ranged attacks at a minimal cost is just that effective. So all in all, this is how I think Goblin Slayers would equip themselves for combat with goblins. Now, after discussing the Slayers' equipment in part 1, in this second part, we will delve into how Slayers would actually exterminate goblins. And first of all, before launching an attack, Goblin Slayers would prioritize gathering information about their target goblin nests. This includes details like the goblin's location, their numbers, their specific habits and strengths, as well as targets they might like to hit, for example remote villages, so that they could be ambushed there, attacked on the way back, or the villages could at least be evacuated in order to deny the goblins supply. Typically, they would obtain this information through careful observation, tips from local villagers, or their tracking abilities. Slayers might also consult their guild for valuable knowledge, like whether there are forest goblins present that can climb trees, or if they have ogres, orcs, or a hobgoblin has been spotted among their numbers. And of course, they wouldn't set out on their missions without the appropriate orc or ogre slayers in such cases. And this brings me to a key point where reality in a true medieval fantasy world would significantly differ from the anime Goblin Slayer. Group dynamics. The hunt for dozens or even hundreds of goblins would usually be conducted in large-scale missions, instead of sending multiple groups of adventurers to different goblin caves. A more effective strategy, and a far safer one at that, would involve deploying a substantial force to a single goblin nest at a time. For example, on one day, a supergroup of 5 adventurer teams, each with 4 members, totaling 20 adventurers, would attack one single specific nest. And after it is exterminated, they would target and destroy the next nest. And then he would hit another, then a 4th, and finally a 5th, rather than sending each group to a different location, which would split their numbers and make a defeat far more likely. And goblins are so vastly inferior in one-on-one combat that professional adventurers wouldn't even be necessary for some missions. Any adult, regardless of gender, is stronger than a single goblin. Therefore, if a goblin threat is spotted near a village and the raids begin, adventurers would likely receive support from dozens upon dozens of armed villagers. Now, these villagers might only possess basic weapons like pitchforks, clubs and stones, but for goblin hunting this would be sufficient, especially in the open terrain. The cooperative approach would also drastically lower the cost of goblin hunting quests for the villagers. One of the main reasons why novice adventurers typically undertake goblin quests in the world of Goblin Slayer is that these quests don't pay very well, and therefore they can't attract veterans and really strong adventurers who wouldn't be as endangered when entering a goblin nest. And therefore, saving drastically on funds by hiring just one adventurer would be a great boon. And again, instead of paying for 4 veterans, they only would found a single veteran and perhaps 1 or 2 apprentices who could then brief and lead a group of 20 to 40 villagers. If the village isn't isolated, support from neighboring villages could also be readily available, because they too want the goblins to be exterminated. And strategies like setting traps and relying on sheer numbers, for which goblins are quite famous, could also be just as easily and likely more effectively be employed by humans as well. Goblin Slayers would also engage in direct combat only as a last resort, and when they significantly outnumber their opponent. Instead, they would set up ambushes and initially avoid direct confrontations, until they lowered the numbers of the goblins significantly. They could also employ hidden traps, pitfalls, and something like this, in order to avoid a direct battle, or at least weaken the enemy significantly. But, and this is also important when it comes to combat itself, ranged combat would play a crucial role in how humans, especially Goblin Slayers, deal with these creatures, because goblins, being smaller and weaker than humans, have a significant disadvantage in ranged combat. So even if they possess bows, their range and power are far inferior to that of actual humans with their human bows. The same applies to thrown stones. A well-aimed stone shot from a sling could easily incapacitate a goblin, if not downright kill it, while a human can easily stay out of range of goblin archers and goblin stone throwers, and the size of goblin stone projectiles would also be smaller because goblins are weaker compared to us humans, and therefore we should also be able to deflect goblin arrows and goblin stones with our shields rather easily. Furthermore, goblins also lack the protective fat or muscle tissue that could shield their small bodies from damage, making them even more vulnerable to these ranged attacks compared to us humans. So again, Goblin Slayers would whenever possible prefer to eliminate goblins from a distance, where also nasty surprises like traps or hidden reinforcements could also be more easily repelled or avoided entirely, due to having more time to react or simply not getting near them at all. And that could be the biggest difference between Goblin Slayers and the more realistic approach of Goblin Slaying. Instead of one man fighting against hordes of goblins, there might be 100 goblins, of which 20 have already fallen victim to traps, pitfalls, and so on and so forth, before a large group of, let's say, 40 humans engages them at range. So the goblins wouldn't face 4 adventurers, but rather 20 adventurers with slingshots at the initial stage of the combat, or at least 40 to 50 peasants, angry peasants at that, who can throw stones, together with a bow-wielding slayer who would eliminate anything that looks like a leader from a distance. Oh, and even then, it wouldn't be a life or death battle for the peasants. What would they do instead? Well, Goblin Slayers would employ a strategy of defeat in detail and attritional warfare, so hit-and-run strategies would also play a big role in Goblin Slaying. Instead of going straight into a nest of 100 goblins, Slayers would attack goblin patrols or intercept raids on their way to the nearest village that goblins intend to pillage. They also could, if they later march on the nest itself, after a week of guerrilla warfare, lure some goblins out by setting fires in front of the entrances to their nests, and then attacking the fleeing goblins with projectiles like stones and arrows before retreating again. Therefore, melee combat would also be avoided as much as possible, as engaging in direct combat would expose them just to unnecessary risk. And as mentioned earlier, staying well outside of the range of goblin attacks is the best strategy here. And due to humans' natural advantage in height, they should also be way faster than goblins, and in terms of endurance, humans can outlast goblins in prolonged chases. So these withdrawal tactics would be commonplace among the Goblin Slayers, and would not be seen as a sign of weakness or cowardice, but just as a sign of a standard procedure. So when outnumbered or just overwhelmed, or simply unsure, which would be in most of the cases, or if the ammunition has dwindled to a point that they might potentially run out of it, then the Slayers and their group would simply withdraw and regroup before attacking again after having restocked on ammunitions and supplies, and so on and so forth. This way the number of goblins would be reduced piece by piece. For example, if there are 5 goblins on patrol or returning from a reconnaissance mission to nearby villages, it might be too risky to attack them all at once, But if two of them are currently kissing a bear trap, the Slayer can emerge from his concealed position and eliminate a third goblin before attacking the remaining two. And this means that he now would have a fairly easy time in defeating the two remaining goblins. And this would be repeated throughout the week of combat that would be required to bring the goblin nest down. And finally, a piece of advice that guildmates or quest givers would give to all adventurers: never enter a goblin nest. Instead, the Slayers would destroy the nests from the outside. Again, as mentioned before, igniting fires in front of the exits could be an effective method to smoke them out. And even if they come out in force, preferring to fight like a cornered rat rather than die from carbon monoxide poisoning, their numerical advantage would be meaningless if they are showered with arrows and stones and other types of projectiles right when they leave the exit. Oh, of course. And if they can just leave 2 or 3 goblins at a time while 20 guys are throwing stones or loosening arrows on them, they would be mowed down without much that they could actually do, because their numbers are still trapped inside their narrow nests and burrows, so they can't really escape all at once. So again, they would be defeated in detail. They would not fight as 100 goblins against 20 or 40 adventurers, but 2 or 3 goblins at a time against these 20 or 40 adventurers or peasants, while they will be constantly showered with projectiles. Of course, the exits from the nest could also be blocked off, and then the goblins would simply be asphyxiated without any final confrontation being needed. Think of the infamous scene from Watership Down to grasp the concept. It is extremely effective to just avoid going into the nest at all. And if they need to confirm that indeed, yes, all goblins are dead, then, and only then, when there's no resistance coming from the nest, despite it being smoked out for like a day or two, only then, the Slayers would carefully enter the nest and make sure that the nest is even standing, because the peasants could still just collapse all of the exits after making sure that there isn't smoke rising from anywhere nearby, therefore the goblin nest doesn't seem to have any additional exits. Then they can just collapse all of the entrances and leave. Maybe they would check on the goblin nest to see if they are truly dead, if the nest is truly abandoned and destroyed. But even if they manage to somewhat reclaim a part of the nest, they would then be so outnumbered that the peasants all on their own could just wipe them out completely. And only if the nest is structurally intact and no resistance whatsoever is coming from the goblin nest, then, and only then, Goblin Slayers would actually carefully enter the nest. And this would be a standard practice. This would be hammered into the heads of any adventurer over and over and over again. This would be also common knowledge in any peasant society, in any village, because dealing with goblins would just be part of normal life. And that's basically how I imagine a more realistic goblin hunt to work, without it being spectacular or overly dramatic. But still, the anime Goblin Slayer does a fantastic job of portraying a realistic goblin hunt. And with that said, now it's your turn. Leave your opinions about how a realistic goblin hunt would truly look like down in the comment section. And while you do this, I say thank you very much for watching, and special thanks to Arder Daddy Arder, ASK, Bad Guy Yee, Bad Burrito 316, Beezer, Ben C, Brandon D, Chrissy, Crowley 0221, Sia, Crystal Prime, Dead Slime, Death is Mercy, Deathless Dragonlord, Demon Xenomorph 1987, Devin Downen, Ding Dong, Dragonlord Plessy du Saxophon, Duckwagon, Dunkler Krieger, Dystopia, Dystopia II, Enigmatic Unicorn, Feral Shivan, Guy with That Head, Hector Marino, Hoss, Huster, Jacob G, Jana B, Jason, J. Morris, Chromius, Kyle R, Lee K. Long, Legendarius, Le Louche Free Britannia with a Mustache, Lexus Fox, Lord Nishikian Rai, Lord Touch Me, Love Razor, Merovec, Mr. Shoes, Mr. Tweaker, Michael R, Michael Y, Nope, Oh Hell No, Normal Toad, Oh Kill, Overlord General Gasper, Paddy Pantum, Personage, Primus 11, Rhinomere, Cune Carcos P, Shangox's Daddy, Shadow Lightning Wolf, Shrine Keeper, Super Tier Magic Batista Bomb, Supreme Cheese, Staris, Ted, Texas Deer, The Orc Warboss, Rock Ed Smasher, T.E. Wang, Vash Hawkeye, Vegito27, Venture Fanatic, Wilhelm, Xenokai, and Zonagon. Thanks guys. And anyway, have a nice day and I see you all again soon on my next video.